All right. Well, if you're visiting this morning, my name's Cody Graves. I'm the minister here at First Christian Church. I'm thrilled that you're here with us. I'm sure by choice. I'm sure no one bribed you with lunch or anything. That's fine. But I'm glad that you're here. We are in the middle of a sermon series on Jesus. And with the sermon series entitled Jesus Is, and we simply want to know who Jesus is. What did he do? What was he about? What made him so important? Who was this person named Jesus? And we're going to actually spend the entire year of 2016 following Jesus around, looking at who he is, listening to what he taught and what he said. And we're going to find out something today that actually is something that you're going to see a lot throughout this series, that Jesus had a different set of priorities. Jesus' priorities weren't the priorities of a lot of the people around him. Okay? Now priorities are hugely important. What you prioritize is so extremely important. I mean, I cannot overemphasize how important priorities are in your life. What you put as 1, 2, and 3 in your life will determine how your life is run. I mean, it will determine decisions you make. It will determine actions you take. Priorities are so hugely important. In fact, priorities will even trump your words. That you'll tell someone, we'll go on a date tonight, or we'll have that happen tonight, and I'll make plans with my spouse, and we're going to have a night out or whatever. But then something at work happens, and I have to cancel that. And I said my word was this, but my priorities led me in a different direction. You tell someone, we'll have company over, we'll have people over in our house on this night or whatever, but for whatever reason, it didn't get cleaned up the way you wanted it, and you have to cancel, and your priorities override even what your words said, even what you said with your words. You tell your wife, okay, honey, I'll take out the trash, next commercial, and it's an hour and a half later. That's your priorities override what your words even say. Priorities are so important in your life, so important, and what you prioritize is what you make sacred. What you prioritize is what you make sacred. Now, sacred is kind of a churchy word. It's kind of a religious-y word. Really, all it means is what's sacred in your life is the thing which you will sacrifice for. It is the thing that you will that cannot be moved, that cannot be touched, that you will give up time, money, energy for. And the thing that you put at the top of your list, or the things that you put at the top of your priorities, those are sacred to you. You will give up a lot for those to meet those needs. Now, here's the thing. If your priorities are misaligned, if you make the wrong thing sacred, it will bring so much pain into your life. And this is true if you're a follower of Jesus or not. This is true regardless. That if your priorities are misaligned, if your priorities are out of whack, it brings so much pain into your life. No, I really did want to be married to you. No, I really do love my family. But because my priorities were out of whack, because I made the wrong thing sacred, I lost those things. It will bring so much discomfort because you have these intense feelings, but your priorities don't match up with them, and it just feels like your life is broken. My priorities head one direction, my life heads another direction. And having the wrong priorities, making the wrong thing sacred, it will just mess up your life. But the opposite's true too. If you get the right set of priorities, if you get the right thing at number 1, 2, and 3, if you make the right thing sacred, it feels like your life just begins to click. It feels like things just kind of seem to fall into place that okay, my life is more full of joy and more full of healthiness and happiness, and things just seem to click when you get the right set of priorities, when you make the right thing sacred. Priorities are so incredibly important. And Jesus knew this. Jesus knew that priorities run your life. So having the wrong set of priorities will hurt you and others. But having the right set of priorities is what you need to flourish. In our text today, if you got your Bibles, we're going to be in John chapter 2 today. In our text today, in John 2, we're going to see people who have the wrong set of priorities. In the Gospel of John chapter 2, Jesus is going to stumble upon this instance where these people, they've made the wrong thing sacred. They've put the wrong thing at the top of the list. And it's actually hurting others. This is what happens in John chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 13. Jesus is talking and he says, "It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. So it's almost time for Passover. Now Passover gets its name from the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus. And when the final plague came, it was the death of all the firstborn children. Now, if you were an Israelite and you did what you were supposed to do, you could avoid that. You would be passed over. That wouldn't happen to you. So it gets its name from that, but really the Passover celebration is a celebration of God's love and His justice. It's a celebration of God freeing the slaves from Egypt. So Jesus goes to Jerusalem for this celebration. And then verse 14, it says, in the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. So he gets to the temple, and the temple was a big area. And once you got into the temple, it was divided off into sections. And the outer section, the outer courtyard, it was open air, and it was the court of the Gentiles. If you were a Gentile, that's as far as you could come. And then once you got inside the building, there was the court of the women, Jewish women, and the court of the Jewish men, and the court of the priests, and the Holy of Holies. So that's kind of how it was sectioned off. And in that outer area, in that outside area, there's a bunch of people there selling animals, bartering with people, exchanging money, because you have to have the right kind of animal to offer as a sacrifice. They're trying to provide a service. Jesus doesn't like that, it seems. In verse 15, it says, Jesus made a whip with some of the ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and the cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace. And then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures, passion for God's house will consume me. So there's some bad priorities on display here. And Jesus has a solution for that. In fact, this is the point of the whole service, all right? This is the point of the whole message. If you fell asleep, just wake up for a second. You can go back to sleep in a minute, okay? But this is the point of the whole thing. Jesus' solution to the problem is throw a temper tantrum and knock everything over and drive everyone out. No, his solution to the problem is this. It's make sacred what God makes sacred. Prioritize what God prioritizes. That's the problem here. Because you see, in the temple here, in the temple, they're the priests, the people who interpret God's will, the people who are close to God, they have the wrong set of priorities. They're not making sacred what God wants them to. In fact, they've made something else sacred, and it's hurting a lot of people. That's what gets Jesus so upset. You see, here in the temple, these priests, in John chapter 2, and the structure of the temple, the authorities of the temple, they've made the temple sacred. And that's never what God wanted for this temple. That's never what he wanted. But what the priests have done is they've made the temple sacred, and the people, they don't really matter. The people are not as important as the process. You see, that's what's happened. They've turned God's temple into just a regular temple. And there were all kinds of temples throughout the ancient world, and they follow what's called a temple system. And in our world, all kinds of religions do this still today. But here's what a temple system looks like. And this is never what God intended for his temple, but that's what they've done. Because everyone else does it, and because it's just kind of natural for us to do this. But this is what they've done. They've made it out to be this temple system. And here's what a temple system is. Okay? A temple system is a way of worship where there are sacred places. There's a sacred place. That means that there's a place that's more important than other places. That there's a place, and it would be the temple, that has some value to it that is intrinsic to that place. It is more important than your living room. It is more important than Pizza Hut. It is more important than any other place. It is a sacred place. And so if you were to damage that, if you were to attack that place, you are attacking God. And God would come and defend it because it is a sacred and important place. So there's sacred places. On top of that, there's sacred texts. Okay? Now, this doesn't mean that just that there's religious texts. Every religion's got religious texts. But these texts are sacred in the sense that the way that they tell you to get to God, that way is sacred. You don't mess with that way. You don't mess with what they say about what you're supposed to do. In fact, you need to interpret it and then tell other people to follow it, and that's where the sacred men come in. And they're almost always men, but you've got these people who are sacred men, and they can interpret the sacred texts. They look at them and they say, this is what you need to do. This is what the sacred texts say. This is the process of coming to God. And the final part of a temple system is there's a large group of sincere followers, a big group of people who will do whatever the sacred men say. So here's what's happened at the temple. is that these priests have turned the temple into the sacred place. They've said God will never let his temple fall. In fact, in the prophets, you see that happen again and again. Just as enemies come in, they say, no, we're in God's temple. This place is sacred. God would, if they attack the temple, they're going to fail. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But they said, no, this is a sacred place. And there's a sacred text. There's a way to come to God. And we're going to define what that way is. You see, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, it said you had to offer a perfect sacrifice to God. It said your sacrifice had to be perfect. And the idea was you can't just bring your leftovers to God. You can't come to the temple and bring the runt of the litter. You can't come to the temple and bring your blind, starving, skinny little lamb, and that's my sacrifice to God. And we don't. It's not good for anything anyway, and so we'll just give it up. You can't do that. You bring your first fruits. You bring your best to God. Now, what exactly does the best mean? What exactly does perfect mean? Well, you come in here with your sacrifice, and I'm examining your animal, and I determine that it's not perfect because, did you notice there's a chipped tooth here on it? And you can't offer that. I know you traveled for days to get to the temple to offer this sacrifice, but you can't do that. So what they would say is, well, you know what I'll do for you, and I'll help you out here. I'll buy this animal off of you. Now, it'll be discounted because it's not perfect, the chipped tooth. I mean, come on. It's worthless to be offered as a sacrifice. So I'll buy it from you. It'll be discounted. Now, we have other vendors here set up that have priest-approved perfect animals. Now, you go to them and you buy from them. Now, of course, they're perfect, so they're a little expensive, but all this money goes to the temple anyway. All this money goes to the temple anyway. And you see what had happened is that these priests had made the process sacred. And they missed the point. They said, you know what? It doesn't matter if this is a hardship for you. It doesn't matter if this is a burden for you. It doesn't matter if this is hard on you or if this makes you upset or angry. All that matters is that you offer the right sacrifice. That's it. It doesn't matter if you stand there with clenched teeth and closed fists because you're angry at all the extra expense that you had to pay out. As long as your sacrifice is offered, that's all that God cares about because the process is sacred. But the people weren't. And God never wanted his temple to be like that. In fact, in Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, this is what God says. This is one of the prophets in the Old Testament delivering God's message. And God says, I want you to show love, not offer sacrifices. I want you to know me more than I want burnt offerings. That you have this problem, this same problem hundreds of years earlier that's happening at the temple in Jesus' day. Where they're saying, as long as you offer your sacrifice, as long as you keep the process, that's all God cares about. That's all God cares about. As long as you do the right thing, as long as you have the checklist and you check it off, that's all God cares about. As long as you come here, and you know what, it might be a little bit of an extra expense, but you know what, that doesn't matter. That's all God cares about. And yet God has already said, hundreds of years earlier, you know what, I would much rather you love one another. I'd much rather you be a person, a good person, then you offer your sacrifice and your clenched teeth and your closed fists and you're angry. And no, I'd much rather you know me than give your burnt offerings up. You see, God always meant for his temple to be a signpost to something else. God always meant for his temple to show people that he loves them, that he's a forgiving God, that he's a caring God. It was always supposed to be a signpost to Jesus. And yet like a dog who you're trying to tell them, go there, no, you're pointing at your toy, no, get your toy, that right there, and they can't take their attention off your finger. They became so obsessed with the signpost that they forgot what it was pointing to. And they made the signpost sacred. And it doesn't matter if it's a hardship on the people, because as long as they do the process, that's all that's important. As long as they come to the sacred place and they listen to the sacred men talk about the sacred text, this is what God wants you to do. That's all that matters. And so Jesus comes along and he's a little upset by this. Jesus says it's not all about this. It's not all about this. This is not what it's supposed to be. This is a signpost to something else. This is God pointing to something else. In fact, it's God pointing to me. And in a very dramatic way, in a very intense way, he demonstrates, no, this is not what it's all about anymore. It's not about sacred places and sacred texts and sacred men anymore. No. Following God's going to be about something else now. Now, the problem with that is that Jesus came and he said, this is not what it's about anymore. It's about something else. But as the church developed, we kind of took some of those things back. We said, well, we kind of miss that system that we used to have. And so we came up with things in the Middle Ages like relics, sacred things, sacred men, priests and bishops and popes. We came up with things like sacred places. Jerusalem's a sacred place. We need to go and conquer it because it's important. And as Jesus is saying, no, it's not about the places and the texts. It's not about the things. It's about something else. There's something else that God thinks is sacred. It's not about this, but we let it trickle back in. And in fact, in the 21st century, we do it too, where we have our sacred places. We have our sacred buildings. I remember when I was in college, I was preaching at a little church in a little town of Collins, Missouri. Little church, 30, 40 people, great people and everything. But in the town right next to ours, just 5-10 minutes away, very close, there was another even littler church with about 8 or 9 people in it. And every winter, their heater would break for a month or two. They would have to come and worship with us. And they were nice, and we got along, and they liked us, and we liked them. And finally, we just said, well, why don't you guys just come and join our church, I mean, there's so few of you, and it seems like you're having so many problems there. Why don't you guys just come to our church? Well, no, we can't do that. Well, why? Because we can't get rid of our building. We can't do that. All their time, all their energy, all their money, all their resources went into keeping the building running. They weren't doing anything in their community. They weren't being any kind of light for others. They weren't able to show love to anyone else because they just didn't have it. They didn't have the resources, the time, because they spent all of that on trying to keep the building operating. And you know what? If a place was sacred, that's a noble thing. If a place could be sacred, that would be a very noble gesture. That for God, I'm going to keep this place open. But since places aren't sacred anymore, they were wasting their opportunities. That they didn't have any more time, they didn't have any more money, they didn't have any more energy to be a light in their community, to love their neighbor, to be Jesus to others, because they spent all of it, as a group, they spent all of it on their building. And see, we still have the same problem. Where we think places are sacred, we think songs are sacred, we think symbols are sacred. Symbols are great. They should point us to Jesus. They should point us to God. But there is nothing sacred about a symbol. There's nothing sacred about our lovely and beautiful pulpits and all that. They look great, and they should point us to God's beauty and His wisdom and His majesty. But there's nothing sacred about them. Jesus says it's not about this. There's something else that's sacred. This was Jesus' solution to the problem. That Jesus said, you know what? It's not about these things anymore. It's about people. People are sacred. It's simple. It seems to be the opposite of that. You think, well, okay, if things aren't sacred, what's sacred then? Well, people. Okay, duh, that makes sense. But no, Jesus said, no. You don't understand. People are sacred to God. And His entire ministry was about that. In fact, in our text today, Jesus gets upset because the people are being trampled on, because the people aren't being cared for. The court where how I said where all this these bartering was going on, these animals, these coins being changed over, all this haggling and talking and everything that happens with this kind of marketplace atmosphere, it was happening in the court of the Gentiles. Now, in the ancient world, there were a ton of people who weren't Jewish, who loved God, but weren't quite ready to get circumcised. Okay? You can understand that. Like, that makes sense, right? I mean, most of you guys can understand that anyway. Man, Yahweh, God sounds good. I like this Jewish God, but I'm not quite ready to get circumcised yet. You could only go as far as the court of the Gentiles. You were still viewed as somewhat of an outsider. And so here's this thing. We need to make sure people are offering the right, perfect sacrifice. So where are we going to do this at? Well, let's just put it out in the court of the Gentiles. Who really cares? They're not Jewish. They're not really one of us. It's kind of the visitors section. So who really cares? Just what's really important is that we make sure the Jewish people have what they need. Who really cares? I'm sure it's difficult worshiping when you got animals making noises, people yelling at one another about prices. I'm sure it's difficult to worship with that, but you know what? Who really cares? And Jesus gets angry because there's this huge hindrance to people coming and worshiping God, and nobody cares. Nobody cares because the process is what's important, but the people weren't. And so Jesus gets angry and he drives everyone out and he says, no, this shouldn't be happening in God's house. People, there shouldn't be this hindrance to people coming to worship. All throughout his ministry, it was like that. Jesus says, you know what? You want to sum up the entire Old Testament? Here's what it is. Love God and love your neighbor. People. You know what's sacred? You know what should be at the top of your priority list? God and people. Love God and love your neighbor. Make them sacred. Jesus says, you know what? There's a story of this Samaritan and this Israelite, and the Samaritan helps the Israelite out after he got robbed by these bandits, and he provided for him and he paid for his room. Samaritans and Israelites hated each other. They would kill each other often, okay? They hated each other. And Jesus says, you know what's sacred? People, not politics. People are sacred. I don't care if they're from Iraq or if they're from China or if they're from South America or where they're from. People are sacred, not politics. Jesus said, you know what? People are sacred, not religious traditions. That all the time he would, quote unquote, break the Sabbath. He would do something that people said, no, you're supposed to rest on the Sabbath. We've defined what rest is. You're not fitting that definition, so you're doing something wrong. And Jesus said, you don't understand. We weren't made for the Sabbath. The process is not sacred. No. The process was made for us. The Sabbath was made for man because people are what's God's priority. All throughout Jesus' life, I mean, if there was anyone who deserved to be sacred, it was Jesus. And yet Jesus washed other people's feet. And yet Jesus said, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve you, to give my life up as a ransom. Which he did. He died for people because people are sacred. And when he died, the curtain that separated God from humanity that was in the temple was torn in two because God was able to come out and be with people. You are sacred. They are sacred. People are what's important. They are at the top of God's priority list. And as a church, as Christians, the solution to our problem is simple, that people should be at the top of our priority list too. That they should be what we focus on, that they should be what we're after, is we're after people. They're what's sacred. The process isn't, the setup isn't, the design isn't, the people are what's sacred. And we want to connect them with God. That's our priority. That's number one, is the people are sacred. That's what mattered to Jesus, and as a church, the solution to our problem is that. You see, the problem is, you talk to people and you ask them, if they don't come to church or they have a problem with church, and you ask them why. And, I've never heard someone say, well, I just don't go to church because they believe Jesus is the Son of God. Yeah, I just don't do that. I've never heard someone say, I don't go to church because I don't think loving your neighbor is appropriate. I don't get into that. I don't do that thing. That's never the reason. People resist church for 1,000 reasons. Those are the two that are legitimate. If you can't get into Jesus being the Son of God, which that's okay with some people, sure. And if you can't get into loving your neighbor, those are the two legitimate reasons not to come to church. The things that people resist about church, the church should be resisting. The things that people say, well, I don't go to church because it's confusing. I don't get it. It's not practical. It's boring. All those things are things that we shouldn't be about anyway. That unless someone says, I just don't, loving your neighbor, that's not for me. Okay, I get that because that's what we're all about. If someone says loving and following God, that's not for me. Okay, I get that because that's what we're all about. People resist church for so many reasons that shouldn't be core to our faith anyway. Jesus said people are sacred. People are the priority to God. And the simple solution for the church is let's make people the priority again. Let's have people loving our neighbor be the priority. They are the priority, not the process. And you know what? In our personal lives, we do the same thing. We make things the priority instead of people. We make work, we make job, we make money, we make pleasure the priority instead of people. And the reverse is true just as much in our personal lives as it is as a church. That when you make people the priority, things they go better. God built you, and he built me, he built us, he built community, he designed that. And the way he designed is for us to relate to one another, for us to love one another. And so when we're not doing that, things feel weird. But when we start to make people the priority, it feels like things just kind of start to click because they do. God built us that way. And so when we make people the priority, I guarantee you, your life will be better. I guarantee you, once your family becomes your priority, your joy and your happiness in life will increase. I guarantee you that once your marriage becomes your priority, that your sense of satisfaction will increase. And I guarantee you that if you can make people your priority, peace and joy will just come into your life. Think about how less stressful it would be, as if when you had company over, you didn't kill yourself with how your house looked. Because the priority is, I have people in my home. I have people in my home. I have community in my home. What an incredible thing that is. To have people who love me and I love them, and we're going to be in community. We're going to fellowship with one another. That's the priority. I obviously don't want my home to look like a dump, but I'm not going to kill myself to make it perfect because people are the priority. Perfect home. How much less stress would we have in our lives if we didn't care about always being right, or we didn't care about always being in charge, but we just said, hey, I care about you. Think about how simple that is. Think about how basic that is. You're my priority. You're my priority. In the church and in our personal lives, people being the priority, making people sacred, it just works. In John chapter 2, there was this problem that people, that the priests, that the people who ran the temple, they didn't care about the people. The people were being trampled on. They were being distracted. There was this huge hindrance, this huge burden. It became a burden to go and worship God at the temple. In fact, that's why groups of Jews just said, we're done with the temple, and they would go do their own thing. There was a group called the Essenes, and they said, we're done with the temple. It's just such a burden. It's such a burden to go and worship God. So we're going to go out and form our own community and do our own thing. We're done with this. The process became sacred, and the people weren't, and it was such a burden to them. And Jesus says, whoa, this is never the way it was supposed to be, and this is not the way it's going to be from now on. The people are what God cares about. See, the people in the temple, the priests, they thought God was like a vending machine. Okay? Here's the thing I want. Here's the reward I want. Here's what I want from God. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the appropriate change. I'm going to put it in the machine. I'll push the appropriate buttons, and I will get what I want. That's not the way God is, though. God's not a vending machine. He wants a relationship. God's not something that you push buttons on and make the correct change and do things just right, and I'll get what I want. No. God says, I want you to know me more than I want burnt offerings. I want you to know me. I want to be in a relationship with you. We have an opportunity as First Christian Church to carry out the mission of our founding father, Jesus, and make people sacred. Make them our number one priority. To do what Jesus said, which is to love God and love others. We have a great opportunity to do that in 2016. I hope we can follow Jesus and hope we can follow his example. Not by trashing someone's yard, but I hope we can follow his example by saying, you, they are our priority. Let's pray. God, we love you. And we just pray for the strength to make people a priority, to make people sacred. That God, that can get people in trouble sometimes if we make the wrong people the outsider, if we make the criminals sacred. Some people might not like that. God, give us the strength to push through that. God, give us the strength to make people sacred when they're not our kind of people, when they don't get into the same humor we get, or they don't dress the way we do. God, help us to have the strength to make them our priority. God, help us to remember that following you means being about what you were about. And you were about loving others. We love you, God, and we hope that we can be a light in the darkness. We hope that people will see what we do and they'll say, I want to be a part of that. Because we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. We pray this in your son's name. Amen.